In June 793 AD, monks on Lindisfarne Island, also called Holy Island, off Northumberland, England, didn't know sleek ships were racing through the waves toward them. The ships glided to shore, and fierce-looking, bearded men with swords and axes jumped out and ran to the monastery. They attacked the scared monks and killed them all. These attackers stole gold, silver, and other treasures from the monastery. After grabbing all the valuables, they sailed back to the northern sea and vanished. These raiders later became known as the Vikings. Fierce warriors from the cold northern region of Scandinavia are known for their hit-and-run raiding tactics, and from these ambush and plunder tactics, European nations began to pay great attention to Viking culture. And from the Viking raids on the Lindisfarne monastery, Europeans began marking the start of the Viking era. But who really are the Vikings? What drove these seafaring adventurers to take on perilous voyages across the vast northern seas and beyond? Why did they suddenly appear in history, thrive for 3 centuries, and then vanish in the currents of time? Vikings were a group from Scandinavia who lived in the Middle Ages. But the Scandinavian countries as we know them now didn't exist until the Viking era ended. There are 2 versions for when the Viking era started. Scandinavians believe the Viking era was from 750 to 1050. From an Anglo-centric view, the Viking era began in 792 and ended in 1066. In the early Viking period, Vikings lived in small kingdoms, and due to the Viking Age, Scandinavia changed from loosely connected tribes and small kingdoms to the 3 Nordic countries we have today. These were smaller, tribe-like areas that often fought each other. As the Viking era went on, the Vikings explored England, Europe, and even Asia. These small kingdoms then allied, marking the earliest unity for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Viking ancestors were Germanic people who, around 2,000 years before the Viking era, started migrating from northwestern Europe to Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, like their forebears. Vikings were farmers, even those who raided, in colder parts of Scandinavia. They relied more on hunting, fishing, and whale hunting. Viking merchants lived in larger areas, sailing European trade routes with their sturdy ships. So, what turned these seemingly harmless, ordinary people into terrifying figures? One possibility is overpopulation. However, many historians argue that this only applies to Western Norwegia, where farmland is limited. The Oxford Illustrated History of the Vikings states that most of the first generation of Vikings sailed mainly to seek wealth, not land. Especially kings and chieftains who did so because they needed a lot of income to maintain their power. Other Vikings might have left Scandinavia to escape family feuds and local wars. However, recent research has provided a clear possible reason why Scandinavians ventured far from their shores. Some studies attribute it to the bride wealth practice, where a Scandinavian man wishing to marry a woman had to pay a sum to her family. This is what drove the men there to raid outside their country. Also, there's a shortage of marriage partners in Scandinavia. This is due to selective female infanticide and other suspected reasons for the lack of women there. It's a combined effect of polygyny, concubinage, and social inequality in their culture. Another factor is the Vikings, who often had more than one wife. As a result, they had many children, but usually only the eldest son inherited the family wealth, so the younger siblings had to strive on their own to achieve their life and success. According to The Birth of Europe, sons without inheritance formed a big, dangerous elite force, determined to get what they wanted by any means, whether conquering their own land or pirating abroad. Beyond that, they had the strength to chase wealth, fame, and glory. And to show how strong the Vikings were, there was the long, dark winter in the north. In History of the Gods, published in the mid-6th century, it talks about the Adagid or Alogi tribe in Scandinavia, living where summer had 40 days without night and winter 40 days without night. So, Scandinavians were used to extreme weather, even without sunlight. Due to these natural habits, Scandinavians grew tough, relying on intelligence and resilience to survive. The Scandinavians' close ties with the sea, vast forests, and perilous mountains laid a strong base for their conquests across lands they would later visit. In 799, Danish Vikings began attacking a region known as Frisia, a coastal area of Europe from Denmark to the Netherlands. From there, they sailed rivers like the Loire and Seine, raiding towns and villages deep into Europe. In 845, these Vikings even raided Paris. King Charles the Bald paid them 3,000 kilograms of silver to leave the city, but they returned, plundering not only Paris but also areas as far as Troyes, Verdun, and Tau. Later that year, these Vikings sailed to Spain and Portugal, attacking those regions for the first time. They plundered small towns and even occupied Seville temporarily that year. However, when attacking Seville, the Arab fighters fiercely resisted, forcing the Vikings to retreat quickly, with their forces nearly destroyed. Still, these Vikings came back in 859, this time with a fleet of 62 ships. After ravaging parts of Spain, they attacked North Africa, and even though their ships were loaded with loot, they went to Italy and plundered Pisa and Lena, which was once a city called Luna. However, at the same time, starting in the 800s, some Viking groups stopped following their predecessors' tradition of attacking, conquering, and plundering before sailing away, as during these years, Vikings are believed to have arrived at the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea. Though initially these Vikings traded, they later settled on the island and made it a hub for traveling traders and sailors. In these years, some Vikings began spending winters in the areas they had raided. Some Vikings who settled in northern France later became known as Normans or Northmen, and their territory is still called Normandy to this day. Norwegian Vikings focused on many outer islands. For example, they occupied the Orkney and Shetland Islands in the 800s. Even in the following years, Vikings went on to colonize Iceland. There, they established the Althing Parliament. Even now, the Althing still functions as a governing body in Iceland and is the oldest parliamentary assembly in the West. In 850, Vikings also began spending winters in England, with their first base being the Isle of Thanet at the mouth of the Thames River. In the wave of Viking attacks in England after 851, only one kingdom, Wessex, managed to resist. Viking warriors, mostly from Denmark, conquered East Anglia and Northumberland and dismantled Mercia. Meanwhile, in 871, King Alfred the Great of Wessex was the only king to defeat the Danish Vikings in England. So, the Danish Vikings left Wessex and settled in the north, in an area called Denlau. Many of these Vikings became farmers and traders, making York a top trade city. In the early 10th century, the English army led by Alfred's descendants from Wessex started to reclaim Scandinavian lands in England. The last Scandinavian king, Eric Bluedax, was expelled and killed around 952, uniting England into one kingdom. Then the Vikings from Sweden sailed east through the Baltic Sea to the major waterways of Eastern Europe, the Volkhov, Lovet, Dnieper, and Volga rivers. Finally, they reached the Black Sea and the rich lands of the Byzantine Empire. Some Viking traders even reached Baghdad via the Volga River and the Caspian Sea. Swedish chieftains eventually ruled the vast Slavic lands in Dnieper and Volga. These invaders were called Rus, a term some believe is the origin of the word Russia, or also known as the land of the Rus. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab explorer and Islamic missionary among the Vikings, described his encounter with the Rus or Russia people heading to the city of Volga in the Bulgar kingdom. During his journey, Ibn Fadlan documented and described the Rus people as having the most perfect bodies compared to other nations he had encountered. The Rus people had tall statures like palm trees with blonde hair and reddish skin. Their bodies were covered with tattoos in green, blue, and dark colors from their fingertips to their necks. Each had strong weapons, from axes to long swords. In Russia, Vikings slowly mixed with the Slavs already there. With the Slavs, Vikings traveled the Black Sea, trading with Eastern people along the Silk Road like the Samanids. Vikings and Slavs also raided Eastern Roman areas around Constantinople. In 985, a Viking named Eric the Red set up a colony in Greenland. In 1002, Leif Erikson, Eric the Red's son, called the Fortune, sailed west from Greenland to Baffin Island and then to Labrador's coast. But the wind turned his ship, making him stray far from Greenland. Because of the ship's diversion, Leif reached a cape he named Finland, now known as Newfoundland. For this matter, the Atlas of the Viking world states that Leif Erikson was likely the first Norse to see North America. Also, the Nordic Council book says Leif Erikson was the first European to reach America's shores long before Columbus. During Eriksson's time, most of the Nordic region became a unified kingdom for the first time, later known as Norway. Gradually, the Norwegian kings took control of the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland, and established relations with Viking kings in Sweden and Denmark. The next year, Leif's older brother, Thor, led an expedition to Finland, but Thor was killed in a conflict with the locals. However, a few years later, between 60 and 160 Vikings set up a settlement in Finland, but due to ongoing resistance from the natives, they only stayed there for 3 years and never returned. Not long after, Vikings from Denmark and Norway arrived in the British Isles, no longer as raiders but as an army in a fleet of longships. Some Viking ships were quite long for that era, called longships because they ranged from 45 to 75 feet or 14 to 23 meters and could hold 100 warriors. They were sturdily built from oak with 40 to 60 rowers seated on rowing benches. Each ship had a single mast with a square sail, often striped in bright colors. Bright shields overlapped along the ship's rail. The ships were pointed at each end so they could move forward or backward without turning. They had high curved prows, usually carved in the shape of dragons, and Viking ships were often called dragon ships. But the Vikings did not. They dared to light fires on their wooden ships. So, when Vikings were on long sea voyages, they would anchor in a calm bay each night. Then they would set up tents on the shore, light fires, and cook food. Porridge with meat or dried fish is a common dish for them. Sometimes they eat bread, butter, and cheese. If spending the night on the ship, they unroll leather sleeping gear and lie on the rowing benches. The Vikings were not only interested in raiding. When their hit-and-run attacks were replaced by colony formation, they changed tactics. And when they realized colonization greatly impacted Viking society in the conquered regions, the Scandinavian countries, the Vikings' birthplace, united under Harald Fireher in the mid-10th century as the new, powerful, and Christian king of Denmark, marking the start of the Second Viking Age. However, Harald disrupted Norway's unity by giving each of his sons the title of king. Therefore, Norway remained divided for some time. When Harald became king, some dissenters went to Iceland and set up a colony. Large raids were often led by royal leaders, striking Europe's coasts, especially England, where Alfred the Great's lineage was shaky. Harald's son, Svein Fogberg, who was rebelling, was tasked to lead the Viking attack on England starting in 991, conquering the kingdom by 1013 and sending King Athelred into exile. Svein died in 1014, leaving his sons Knut and Kenneth, who then took the throne and ruled the Scandinavian kingdom of England, Denmark, and Norway in the North Sea. After Knut's death, his two sons took over. However, both died in 1042, and Edward the Confessor, the son of the previous king without Danish blood, returned from exile and reclaimed the English throne from Denmark. But soon after, Edward died, and with no heir in 1066, Harold Godwinson, Edward's most powerful noble son, claimed the throne. Upset with Harold's claim, the last Viking king, Harald Hardrada from Norway, attacked England from Stamford Bridge near York. But Harold's forces defeated the invasion. In their prime, the Vikings created new political states ruled by Scandinavian dynasties. However, they didn't stay strangers for long, because many Vikings eventually blended into their new cultures, even in religion. For instance, a Viking chief named Rollo, who conquered a coastal area in France called Normandy, meaning the land of the Northmen, converted to Catholicism. One of his descendants was William, Duke of Normandy, after his battle at Hastings with Harold in 1066 between the English Viking descendants and the Norse. Finally, Duke William, just weeks after his victory, was crowned King of England on Christmas Day in 1066. However, after William was crowned king, he quickly countered all Scandinavian influences in England and introduced a new feudal era with governance, land ownership, and medieval French economy systems. Therefore, Els Rosdal, a historian who studies Viking life in his book The Viking, says, if there is a date to mark the end of the Viking era, it must be 1066. Additionally, in the 1200s, The Viking kingdoms in Scandinavia became independent nations. And besides that, the end of the Viking era was marked by the 1300s global cooling period, which made the seas too frozen and stopped the Vikings from traveling with their ships. Outside Scandinavia, Vikings are often called uncivilized. The Danes, Northmen, or Norse. Since historians use Viking for all Scandinavians of that era, outsiders equate them with barbarians. Vikings called themselves Norsemen, meaning people of the north. This refers to their Scandinavian origins. Viking culture and social life were influenced by Norse mythology. Norse mythology is the belief and legends in Northern Europe before Christianity. For more info, Nordic or Norden means north, referring to the northern part of Europe and the North Atlantic. Countries in this region include Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Ellen. The term Nordic often refers to Scandinavian countries or those in Northern Europe, forming the core of the Nordic region. However, Scandinavia includes only Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But the Vikings weren't just barbarians attacking with swords and axes. The Vikings adapted by settling distant lands and blending with local cultures. As farmers, they became permanent residents, and as rulers, they took foreign thrones. This shows the Vikings mastered not just the sea and sword, but also farming and politics. Beyond that, the Vikings were more than raiders and warriors. They were skilled sailors, traders, and explorers who influenced Europe's development. One key example of the Vikings' seafaring and trade network is the Volga trade route. By navigating the Volga River in Russia, the Vikings accessed the rich lands of Byzantium and the Islamic world. This enabled them to trade extensively, swapping furs, honey, and slaves for luxury items like silk, spices, and precious metals. The Vikings were crucial in cultural exchanges between East and West, spreading ideas, technology, and knowledge across Europe. These discoveries expanded the Vikings' horizons and brought major changes to Europe's political and cultural landscape. The Viking exploration and settlement in Iceland in the 9th century showed their adventurous spirit and adaptability. Seeking refuge from conflicts and the crowded Scandinavia, Viking settlers traveled west to this far and empty island. With great sailing skills, these Vikings faced dangerous waters and built a thriving community in the tough landscape. The Vikings farmed, raised animals, and created a unique political and legal system called the Althing. This system, based on democracy and equal representation, was one of the first examples of representative government in Europe. The Viking exploration of Greenland, led by Eric the Red, showed the Vikings' bravery and determination. In the 10th century, Eric the Red sailed west from Iceland and found a vast land of ice and snow. Despite tough conditions, the Vikings set up small farming communities, relying on farming, hunting, and fishing to survive. The Greenland colony thrived for centuries with a trade network linking them to Europe and other Vikings across the North Atlantic. Entering the 11th century, Viking explorer Liv Erikson ventured westward and found a land they called Vinland. This area, believed to be today's Novaland, Canada, is rich in resources like timber and game. The Vikings set up a settlement called L'Anse aux Meadows, marking early European settlement in the New World, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Scientists think the Vikings settled there 471 years before Columbus's first voyage. Research in the journal Nature reveals for the first time, researchers estimate when Europeans first set foot in America. Using tree ring dating from 3 wood pieces, evidence shows Vikings occupied a site in Novaland, Canada, and researchers pinpoint the tree cutting year as 1021, or 471 years before Columbus arrived. Though the Vikings' stay in North America was short, it showed the potential for transatlantic exploration and future European growth. Their ventures into places like Iceland, Greenland, and North America led to major political and cultural shifts, creating new communities and expanding European views. The Vikings turned conquered cities into trade hubs. Hedeby, now in Germany, and Rhein were key trading cities in Denmark during the Viking era. The Vikings traded peacefully with other societies. Scandinavian countries traded among themselves and with other European nations.
Norway sent herring and salt to Sweden. Denmark got sheep from the Faroe Islands. Greenland got wood from Labrador and grains and iron from Europe. They paid with walrus and narwhal ivory, live for animals, and even live polar bears. One of the most valuable things the Vikings traded was slaves. They were usually Irish, Finnish, German, or Slavic people captured during conquests. A free Viking might be enslaved due to debt or crime. But this was rare. Another important thing left by the Vikings is in Ireland. Curator of Archaeology at Mons National Heritage, Alison Foss, said the Vikings were on the Isle of Man for 4 centuries, and their influence only ended in 1266, when it was returned to King Alexander III of Scotland. And all the finds in the UK's national collection, from fishing hooks to swords and silver piles, and the ornate oval brooch, are vital as they confirm that Viking women traveled with their husbands or male companions to the Isle of Man. And from these findings and understanding Viking history in Ireland, a clearer picture of the Viking era emerges. In Ireland, the Vikings introduced place names like Derby, Snivel, and Finwald, the parliament they set up while ruling the Isle of Man. The Vikings, with their Thingvellir parliament, left a legacy of how people lived, what could be done, and what couldn't. And this influence persists to this day. Even the Vikings' influence in England was huge. This is evident even from the names of cities in England. For instance, names ending in B and Thor come from Norse, the Vikings' language. B means farm or town, Thor means village, and 20% of English words come from Norse. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Vikings is respect, a virtue that infused every part of their lives. Blood feud shows their strong commitment to their honor code. If someone was killed, their family could avenge by seeking retribution. The belief in justice for wrongs against kin was key to the Vikings. Yet, the Vikings saw the endless violence cycle as disruptive. So, they offered an alternative: blood money. In this practice, the defendant's family can offer compensation to the victim's family, providing a way to resolve conflict and prevent further bloodshed. This not only shows the Vikings' commitment to honor and justice, but also their pragmatic approach to maintaining peace within their community. The Viking society was highly organized and structured with a clear hierarchy shaping member interactions. Like many other civilizations before them, the Vikings had a similar structure, including a caste system. At the top of the social ladder was the king or jarl, holding political and military power. Below them were the huskarl or noble warriors, individuals from the nobility who had proven their skills on the battlefield. These elite warriors enjoyed privileges and status that set them apart from the rest of society. Below the warriors were the carls or free people, who had certain rights and freedoms but lacked the prestige of the nobility. Carls typically included fishermen, farmers, and blacksmiths. At the lowest level were the trolls or slaves, individuals who had lost their freedom and were considered property. Everyone had a specific role and status within this hierarchical structure. And this structure gives insights into how this order affects their daily lives. In Viking society, personal reputation and family ties hold great value and influence. Stories and historical records in some books reveal many instances where a person's reputation determined their social status and influenced their interactions with others. The Vikings valued personal achievements and bravery because these qualities brought honor to themselves, their families, and their communities. This focus on reputation extends beyond individual achievements and also includes family bonds. Being born into a famous lineage brought prestige and influence, opening doors to opportunities that might not be accessible to all Viking society. The Vikings were also very religious but believed in paganism. In Viking religion, the gods were also warriors. Thor the thunder god continuously battled against the ice and snow giants in the north. The chief god Odin led Valhalla, the paradise of warriors. Death in battle was considered the most honorable death. This belief made their soldiers so tough and fearless. They believed in Valhalla, an afterlife like paradise reserved specifically for fallen warriors. Only through death could a Viking enter Valhalla. Thus, the Vikings fought fearlessly and joyfully, calling upon their gods to aid them. Thank you.